talking about offensive tweets. I think it was it Glasgow police who tweeted out saying, if you say something unkind, unnecessary, we might be knocking on your door this weekend, right? This stuff is not good.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, I'm Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Andrew Doyle. Andrew Doyle is a comedian, commentator and playwright. He is behind the fantastic satire account Titania McGrath, which basically is a satire of leftist woke people on Twitter. He also co-wrote Jonathan Pie, which is a satire of news anchors for 3 years, and is the author of Woke, A Guide to Social Justice. We're going to be talking about wokeness, comedy and politics. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello.
Why did you invent the character Titania McGrath?
I was getting very frustrated with the woke movement and what we call the excesses of the social justice movement. And one of the things that I was trying to pinpoint about the movement is that they're impervious to reason, right? So they won't sort of talk. I mean, I was often involved with debates and things like the Battle of Ideas at the Barbican, and trying to get someone from that side of the political spectrum to sit down and talk with people who don't agree proved to be really hard. And what you end up with is a situation where people say, well, look at that panel, everyone's agreeing with you. You're just sort of reinforcing each other's existing views. And I would say, but no, I tried to get one of the woke crew on board, but they won't talk. And part of the reason is what they say is certain things are not up for debate, and therefore we're not going to dignify that by talking. And so if you can't reason with someone, what else is there to do but to mock them, to attempt to try and burst that bubble through satire? And that's what I was attempting to do, and that's why I invented the character. And really it was just for myself. I had no idea that it would become like a thing. I was just doing it on Twitter as a bit of a laugh. In the early days, she kept getting banned all the time. Pretty much every couple of weeks, there would be a 1-day ban, or a couple of times there were a 7-day ban. So I thought, well, this isn't going to last long anyway. And then it just sort of took off. And eventually she got banned permanently and then reinstated. So they sent me the email saying, this is gone now, you can't do this anymore. And then there was a bit of an outcry, and they reinstated her.
What was the reason they gave for banning?
Well, they don't give a reason. They're like Kafka. So what they do, like the trial, you know, where someone's on trial but they don't know why and they never find out why. What they do is they send you an email and they say, you violated our terms of service. And then you look at their terms of service and it's this big, sprawling, nebulous thing that doesn't really mean anything. It basically means we just want rid of you and we don't have to tell you why. And you can't really appeal, because if you appeal, you just get an automated response with more of the same. It's very frustrating. I know lots of people who have been banned on Twitter for saying absolutely nothing. I'm not talking about, there are some people who say some absolutely horrible, ghastly things, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who've expressed an opinion or made a joke or whatever, and they get ditched from the platform, and then they try and find out why, and the sort of the autocrats at Twitter don't deign to tell them, you know, because Twitter's got that weird thing. Most of these sort of huge Silicon Valley tech giants, they hire thousands of people to monitor the content, right? Because one day they decided that they were going to be that they weren't about free speech anymore. That what they were about is monitoring and curating what appears on their platform, which is weird because whenever they're sued for what goes on their platform, they say, yeah, but we're not a publisher. We're just a platform. Well, if you're curating material, you are a publisher. And therefore you should be subject to the same laws as everyone else. It's a weird one. It's something that we need to tackle, I think.
We'll get on to free speech later. Let's stick with Titania though for now. Why do you think she blew up so much? What did it hit a sort of zeitgeist?
I think it's because if you mock, I'm talking about, I think most social justice activists are really good people, and they've got really good ideas, and they want to make the world a better place. And I think the causes of anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia, all of that kind of stuff. These are good causes that virtually everyone gets on board with, right? So we're talking about a minority of social justice activists who have so much power. That's the problem with them, is that if it were just a few people on Twitter mouthing off, right, I wouldn't care about that. It is a minority, but they seem to have infected all the sort of major institutions in the country. Right, so they're there in the quangos, right? They're to whom the government outsources all kinds of authority. They're there in the law. They're there in education. They're certainly there in the media. They're 100% there in the arts. You know, they totally dominate comedy and the arts and drama and TV. So when you have a small group of people who come generally from very bourgeois backgrounds, a very sort of privileged people talking about how oppressed they are, but running everything, that's kind of funny. So it's quite a good idea to mock that, because I think that personally I like to punch up in comedy. You know, there's all this stuff about punching up and punching down, right? And I like to punch up. I like to attack those in power. And this is where the debate lies. You see, so the people who don't like what I do will say that I punch down at minority groups, even though minority groups are never the target, right? So that's just kind of a basic misinterpretation, but quite a common one. But I'm sort of attacking those who would patronise the minority groups, those who want to try and engineer society in the way that they want, those who have a complete intolerance to any kind of dissent, any kind of alternative viewpoint. Even to sort of basic discussion of principle, you know.
Now, you wrote a fantastic article for The Independent that was completely out there, and they published it you submitted it under not your name. Can you talk a bit about that and why you think so many people fall for Titania McGrath being real?
So you're talking about an article by Liam Evans, which is for The Independent. Yes. So Liam Evans submitted an article. Liam Evans doesn't exist. And it was obviously a hoax, like so clearly a hoax. What he was saying was that comedians need to be subject to hate speech laws. And he gave a couple of examples and said, you know, basically the police ought to get involved. Now, this is such a kind of maddeningly authoritarian stance that, you know, if I were working at The Independent, I would look at that and think, well, this is not real, is it? This is made up. This is someone trying to hoax us. But the fact that they published it, because they agreed with the sentiment, right? That's what it exposed. It also exposed the kind of I suppose the lack of any kind of background check. This was a complete unknown, someone with no online presence,
critical
nothing.
Thinking skills.
So nothing there. All it is they wanted to push a woke agenda, right? And it's just that in that article, which is still online, if you take the fourth letter of every sentence, it spells out Titania McGrath wrote this, you gullible hacks. Now, I'm not suggesting they should have spotted that. But the article in of itself was so obviously made up. And of course, the point of this, I mean, I know some people accused or suggested that the point of this was to try and suggest that this is sort of widespread view, that this widespread sort of intolerance to comedy and this widespread sort of puritanism when it comes to comedy. There is that. I don't think it's as widespread as people think, but it's there. But actually, the target of that satire was the media, was the woke media, who absolutely will just go along with absolutely anything with no thought, just sort of blindly push an agenda, and you know, so it worked. But I mean, have a look at the art; it's ludicrous. It's utterly stupid. And saying that, ever since then, there's been a few articles that have come out that have been even worse, published in The Independent and The Guardian. They're the ones that have a particular track record of this stuff that is calling for sort of monitoring of comedy and hate speech laws and all this sort of stuff. So it's not that far away from what people are actually saying.
Now, you've used the word woke quite a lot already in this interview, and you've written even a book, Woke, A Guide to Social Justice. What is woke? Can you just explain it to people? So
this is a problem, isn't it? Because we've been talking now for about 5 minutes and I've used the word a number of times, and maybe the people watching this don't know what it means. So they will have switched off already. Woke is... Well, it's an old term. I mean, it actually comes from the Black Civil Rights Movement. It was about, it was initially about waking up to injustice, you know. It was initially about a good idea. It's been appropriated by contemporary social justice activists. And what it means now, I suppose, is it's actually quite difficult to put your finger on. It's kind of like being hyper-aware to issues of injustice, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., but to an extreme degree, where you're looking for it where it doesn't even exist, where you're determined to find it. That's why you hear them talk about power structures, you know, these sort of vague entities of power structures or unconscious bias. You know, you may never have said anything racist or thought anything racist, but they know that you secretly have this lurking within you. And worse than that, they think, I mean, we've all got like infinite unconscious biases, I'm sure, but the idea that we could control that or legislate against it, you know, when you have I think it was Birmingham University that had older white male academics being mentored by young female black academics, that achieves absolutely nothing. It's absolutely nonsensical and it's silly, and you know, and it needs to be called out. So that's what woke. So when I use the word woke, what I'm talking about is, you know, the kind of Guardian columnists, a kind of very pampered, rich, normally self-identifying as left-wing, but they're not really, who push this kind of agenda, want to be offended by everyone. They want to give more power to the state to control what we say and think. And they want to say to minority groups, we'll look out for you, we'll stand up on your behalf because you don't know what's best for you. So, there's a kind of weird soft racism within that movement. And of course, what all of this stuff does is it generates an awful lot of resentment. You've got poor people, like people on the actual poverty line, being told that they're privileged because they're white, or they're privileged because they're heterosexual or whatever it might be. And they're thinking, yeah, but I can't afford anything. And you've got like a millionaire Guardian columnist telling them that she's the oppressed one because of her race or sexual orientation. And they're thinking, hang on a minute, I can't afford food, right? And that sort of stuff does cause, and this is the thing about the culture war, and this is the thing about woke culture. It has a massive impact. It wins and loses elections. It was a huge contributory factor to Trump's victory. It was certainly in the last general election here. I think it was the same thing. Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party bought into this ideology, and Jeremy Corbyn was announcing his pronouns, things like that. You had that pink bus, was it Harriet Harman with her pink bus about push it, and this very patronising view of women, that women need to be infantilised essentially, and we need to hold their hands and give them a bit of a leg up. And again, it's sort of low-level misogyny masquerading as feminism, and this sort of stuff. And then you had the Liberal Democrats doing exactly that. Well, they're not liberal, are they? Because they wanted to completely undermine the Brexit vote, because they know what's best. It's this very paternalistic viewpoint. And when pushed to ask whether there were two genders or not, Jo Swinson had a real trouble with that. Whether there was such a thing as a biological man and a biological woman, she had a real problem with that because she's bought into this woke agenda, and therefore she can't answer a very straightforward question anymore. People mistrust this. That's the thing. They don't like it. So that's why it. And across the board, there's a really good book by Mark Liller called The Once and Future Liberal, which is about the way in which identity politics and extreme social justice activism loses elections all the time. Look at what Hillary Clinton did. She broke down the American electorate into their various demographic groups. She said, I'm going to target the Latino vote, I'm going to target the LGBT vote, and I'll look after you, I'll help you, that thing about women should vote with their vaginas, this idea, and vote for another woman, this idea. But ultimately, when you're voting for a politician, you're voting for the ideas and the principles and the policies. If you're voting on the basis of skin colour, race, gender, sexuality, all of that sort of stuff, you're making a huge error because those things just simply don't matter.
I mean, "I'm with her" was her slogan throughout the whole campaign, and I think that sort of shows you what Hillary Clinton really was all about. And again, as you say, she lost that election. Let's talk about the effect that wokeness has on society. Now, you sort of touched on there the sort of authoritarian kind of line that they're pushing for. In that, we've seen in Britain police going to people's houses because of tweets. We've seen a woman being sacked because of tweets she made about trans issues. And then she went to this employment tribunal and was told by the judge that what she said was basically outside of our democratic values or whatever. I can't remember the exact quote. So what kind of effect does the woke movement have on Western societies? And how dangerous is it?
It's incredibly dangerous if the police think it is their business to monitor what the general public say and think. Absolutely straight out of Orwell, which has become a cliche, but it's very difficult to think of any other way to describe it. In the Harry Miller case, which is the recent case of the docker from Humberside, who now what did he do? He retweeted a transphobic poem, or a poem that was deemed to be transphobic, and the police investigated this. They phoned him up. They said, "We need to check your thinking." Now, that's a specifically Orwellian phrase. I mean, they may as well have got that out of 1984. And he's currently taken the police to court because their justification was this is a non-crime hate incident and we are obliged to investigate that, right? The police should have absolutely no business. What have they got to do with
investigating non-crime?
Non-crime. It's like, people have been not breaking the law and getting away with it. It's outrageous. It's stupid, right? And but it's not just stupid, it's sinister. So you've got that. You've got the Maya Fastata case, which you mentioned about the woman who had the tribunal on the basis of her belief that biological sex is immutable. Now, that she is totally entitled to that belief. I mean, when it comes to that whole trans issue, we need a discussion. We need, I'm not saying that one side is wrong and one side is right. I mean, I do have my own views, but I'm open to persuasion. But how can I be persuaded if we don't have the discussion? And I think that's That's some, and then we have got a government website at the moment on hate crime, which has a whole paragraph on non-crime hate incidents. And also what you found over the last few years is the police have been actively trawling for this. So you'll see these tweets from the police officers saying, contact, if you've been offended by something, if you've heard something that's offensive, contact us, you know? And I'm not talking about targeted harassment or someone that's against the law, right? We're not talking about that. That's already covered. We're talking about offensive tweets. I think it was it Glasgow police who tweeted out saying, if you say something unkind, unnecessary, we might be knocking on your door this weekend, right? This stuff is not good. And when the Humberside police were challenged on their treatment of Harry Miller with the non-crime hate incident stuff, they said, but this is standard practice. And it is, because it comes from the College of Policing guidelines, which is what is currently being challenged in the court by Harry Miller. I hope he wins, because we have to stop that. It's so, I mean, I'm not saying we're living through this kind of free speech crisis, but every generation has to be vigilant when it comes to free speech, right? You have to watch out for it. And you certainly have to be careful if the state are trying to usurp powers that they should not be having. And this is a really good example of that. So we just need to keep a check on them. We need to we need to curb it. And I think that's what's happening.
What I find fascinating with this whole issue is that it's never really talked about. I mean, in the mainstream press, I mean, you don't see it very much. You see it on Twitter quite a bit, but there's no real discussion, is there?
I think because people think that the culture war is like a sideshow, I think they think it's something that doesn't really matter, and it's just sort of YouTubers and Instagram influencers.
People in their basements, kind of keyboard warriors.
But it's not, is it? Because if you listen to the way our politicians speak, when you hear David Lammy saying that the ERG are worse than Nazis, right? That's straight out of culture war. That's culture war 1.0. One of the biggest tactics of the left-leaning side of the culture war is to smear people as fascists and racists. The fact that mainstream politicians and commentators, mainstream publications, mainstream journalists have bought into this utter fantasy that we live in a society which is populated largely by Nazis and neo-Nazis and fascists, and they're around every corner. The bland truth is that most people are pretty decent, and we live in a really tolerant country. You know, I mean, that major study last year, it was the YouGov study about attitudes towards immigration, and in Britain, turns out, is the most tolerant of all the major European countries. I mean, that's even the EU's own research shows that attitudes towards immigration have softened since the Brexit vote. So we are an extremely tolerant country. But when you have people saying, yeah, but there's this thing called white privilege, and there's unconscious bias, and everyone's a racist, and everyone's a homophobe, and people in the real world are thinking, well, that doesn't match up with my experience, you know? And it's something that needs to be addressed. It's something that desperately infects our politics. And until the mainstream media do treat it as the serious issue that it is, it's not going to go away, I don't think.
Let's talk about the history of the woke movement.
Yeah, okay.
I think people will be fascinated to see where this comes from and why it's here today. And I think, you know, for example, if Winston Churchill was alive today, I think they would probably call him a fascist and a Nazi.
Well, they have done. They absolutely have done. You know, they've said that again on Twitter and social media, but or academic articles and some newspaper articles saying that Churchill was a white supremacist, he had some dodgy views actually about people of colour. Not incredibly atypical for his time, though, it should be said. I mean, you have to be able to.
And it's pretty nuanced. If you actually, and I'm reading a book on Churchill,
right.
I would know about this. But you know, if you go into the detail of his views at the time, they were more liberal than most people, and they were extremely nuanced. He wasn't just an out-and-out racist. There was lots of.
You have to contextualise it historically. You absolutely do. And judging people of the past by the standards of today makes absolutely no sense, because the truth is that the people who are criticising the most, if they had grown up at the same time as him, they'd probably have the same views. So it doesn't make any sense to do this.
So where does this come from?
As I say, the bedrock is good intentions. So, I mean, the reason why I consider the woke movement to be a fundamentally reactionary movement is because it is undoing all the good work of the civil rights movement. If you go back to sort of the 60s and the 70s, if you talk about the black rights movement, gay rights movement, women's liberation, the New Left, groups which all agreed that we have to have free speech in order to achieve any of our goals, groups that were all about liberty and about empowerment, and that is not what this is. So I really like to draw a distinction between what the civil rights... You see, that's the problem, is that the sort of far left and the anti-fascist movement talk about how they are sort of carrying the baton from these struggles. They're not. They're trying to undo those struggles, right? Because those... If you look at Martin Luther King, who's all about the content of the character, not the colour of the skin, they want to invert what he believed. You know, there's no way that the civil rights activists of the 60s would be on board with the woke culture. They would see this as anathema to their worldview. So that's the background, and I think what happened is we went through a period of political correctness in the 80s, early 90s, which I happen to think did some very good things. I think it's difficult to argue with the point that before that time, you did have very casual, unpleasant kind of language and discourse, which was pretty horrible, about race and about sexuality and the likes. And we got through that. And sure, there were mistakes made. Things went too far. There were some stupid overreaching on the part of political correctness. I get that. It's not a simple thing. But the truth is, as a result of that, we've ended up in a situation where we now live, and have done for many years, in a country where if you say explicitly homophobic or racist things or sexist things, you're treated as a pariah, and rightly so. Like, we're not interested in that as a country, as a culture. So what's happened, though, is you've got the sort of political correctness movement has sort of morphed and perverted and become this thing now. These sort of these people who are just desperate to keep it going, almost to pretend that we're still living in that time. I mean, if you think about comedy, like I get this all the time. Like people say to me, because I'm saying that free speech in comedy is really important, they're saying, well, you just want to go back to the days of Bernard Manning. Well, Bernard Manning was a self-confessed racist. I mean, by the way, a very good comic, technically, very good comic, there's no denying it. But he admitted to being racist, and that informed a lot of his material, and certainly his audience saw it that way. I mean, there's no disguising that. But there aren't people like that on the comedy circuit anymore. So when you try and say, well, there's all these people out there doing these problematic jokes that normalise hate and legitimise oppression of minorities, that's simply not true. I always push these people. I say, well, name names. Who are they? Who are these people? Because I know a lot of comedians, and I don't know a single racist among them. Not one. Couldn't name you one. So what I'm saying is, why occupy a kind of mythological world, and why not just occupy the world that we actually live in? You see, if you go back to the, and it's weird that this is coming from the left now. If you go back to the 80s and the late 80s, say, where you had most of the sort of reactionary fantasy stuff was coming from the right-wing tabloids, wasn't it? It was this sort of stuff like, we live in a world where asylum seekers come over here and they get showered in tiaras and diamonds and they get whatever they want, and all of this stuff wasn't real. Let's face it, that wasn't true. It was this fantasy that they were all sort of believing in. They believed that Christmas was being banned and replaced with Winterval, which, by the way, even the Daily Mail admitted wasn't true. So there's that fantasy world, which is a sort of right-wing tabloid fantasy world. And now you've got a new fantasy world, which is the left-wing Guardian independent kind of fantasy world, where you've got sort of prominent commentators who just genuinely think that anyone who wants to have a discussion about politics, anyone who thinks that there are two sexes, anyone who has a qualm about gay marriage must be a fascist, must be a raging neo-Nazi that goose steps their way home every night. This is utterly ludicrous, right? And it comes from people not talking to each other, right? That's what I think we need to get back to. I think we need, because I think the woke movement is sort of so hostile to the idea of discourse and just chatting about things and talking to people. I've been interviewed by right-wing commentators, and afterwards I've been told, well, you're one of them now, right? Well, firstly, what I'd say to that is, I don't think being right-wing is bad. I have no problem with being right-wing. It just doesn't happen to be true in my case. My views are predominantly on the left. I have some sympathies with certain conservative views, so I don't tend to think in terms of an ideology, I just sort of decide on the individual issues, and I'm open to persuasion, and I want to have an open mind. But by talking to someone who has completely different views than me, it's not contagious. It's not like I get, like there's a process of osmosis, and I suddenly become that person. This guilt by association thing is so damaging, because what we need at the moment more than anything is more speech. We need to be talking to the people that we don't agree with, rather than shutting them off. So this is what social media ruins for us. It sort of encourages us to create these echo chambers, to just ignore anyone who doesn't, I will always, on Twitter, talk to anyone who comes with me politely with a disagreement. I will always engage with that. If they come at me and say, you're a Nazi, I'll block them, right? Because I'm not, my view on that is like, if someone were to come at me in the street and say, you're an effing Nazi, would I engage? Would I say, yeah, it's a good point, let's chat about that a little bit? No, I'd walk away. I will never block someone who wants to talk politely about these issues and disagree. I think that's a really good thing. We need to do more of that. And we need to stop saying, don't normalise them or legitimise them by talking to them. Actually, the opposite is true.
Do you really think they actually believe that you are a Nazi, for example, when they accuse you of that?
Right. I don't know. I mean, the thing is, if I thought you were a Nazi right now, if I thought you were a neo-Nazi, I'd probably leave. In fact, I would, right? I know there are some people who can talk to neo-Nazis and try and persuade them out of their delusions, right? There's a guy called Daryl Davis, a musician in America, who has de-radicalised members of the KKK and has all the hoods to prove it, right? This is quite an interesting idea.
Sort of Louis through kind of thing.
Yeah, right. So, and great. I'm glad there are people who can do that. I can't. I don't have the skill. I don't have the patience. I see Nazism, neo-Nazism has been just such a fundamentally delusional. I mean, it'd be like talking to a cult member and explaining to them their God is wrong. You know, I could not deprogram that person, right? So I wouldn't do it. And I also don't like them. I don't like someone who thinks that a certain race is superior to another. I find that really rebarbative and unpleasant. And so, but do they think I'm a Nazi? Well, I've never expressed any view that remotely comes close to it. It is the opposite of my worldview, right? And you won't find me on record ever saying anything that even remotely comes close to tallying to Nazism. So what it is people have imagined in their head that I must be. And then,
do you think it's a sort of, it's a get-out card for them, because then they don't have to engage with what you're saying?
Well, you're saying it's a willful thing then. You're saying it's calculated, and I couldn't possibly speculate about someone's motives. It could well be. I fear it might be legitimate. I fear there's a kind of mass delusion. You know, I've lost friends who have called me to my face a Nazi, right? Close friends. And
did they say why? Did they give specifics?
Try to. And again, it's that thing of, I know what you secretly think. And I'm thinking, well, what have I said? What have I done? And they can't. Because I've always been so vocally against racism and vocally against injustice and prejudice and for equality and for liberty and for free speech, which of course the Nazis clearly loved. It's like, so, and it's impossible to argue with that. So if someone imagines something about you that isn't true and they've just decided it, how do you then
persuade them that I'm not a Nazi?
Because that's what a Nazi would say. So it's this kind of impossible situation. And so I think, I think it must be genuine. For people to think that, I think it must be a genuine delusion. I don't know where you even begin to challenge that. And I think it is about a cultural shift. I think it is like, we need to know, if you call someone a Nazi, you call someone even racist, that's one of the worst things you can call someone. You better be damn sure about that. You better have something to back that up. But they don't. It's become, Blair White, the activist in America, I don't know if she's an activist, but she's a prominent trans figure in America, tweeted out the other day about how racism, homophobia, sexism, when she said, when I hear those terms, my instinct now is not to believe it's true because they've become so watered down. And as she said, that's dangerous. Right, because those terms mean something, and they should have weight and gravity. If you're calling someone a racist, and they are a race, that we need to know. We need to. Now I'm the same. When I hear someone call someone a racist, I think, oh, they're probably not. They probably just read the Daily Mail or the Sun, and they've just said, it's, when Owen Jones says anyone who writes for the Sun is supporting fascism, you think this is, well, for one thing, it's historically illiterate, but it's also really damaging to his own cause. His own ideas, because he will never persuade someone that way. I think it's really sad.
Let's talk about comedy. Obviously, you're a comedian. You do a lot of comedy shows. Let's talk about the history of comedy. So you're talking about sort of political correctness in the early sort of 80s, 90s, and how that has kind of adapted to today, because it's completely different, isn't it?
Oh, it's totally different. You had the alternative comedy movement of the 80s, which was a reaction against that kind of working men's club, what they perceived to be racist jokes and homophobic jokes and that kind of thing. And that was very much tied up with political correctness. And there were a lot of great things that came out of the alternative comedy movement and a lot of fantastic acts, right? People like Jo Brand. Of course, Jo Brand now finds herself in a different situation today when she makes a joke and is accused of inciting violence, right? So that gives you an example of how different things are, The fundamental difference is the alternative comics were railing against the establishment. They were railing against the norm, Now the woke comics are the establishment, and that's the difference. You're not anti-establishment or avant-garde if what you are doing is winning all the awards and getting write-ups in the Guardian. You have it's not. That's just very safe, and that's why the stuff that passes as satire, which is just simply talking about how Donald Trump is orange or the Tories are evil, or that.
Orange man bad.
Right, exactly. It's not satirical. You know, it's just confirming an establishment view, right? So, and that's complicated because, of course, Trump is the establishment as well. So you've got two sort of levels of establishment, haven't you? You've got the political establishment, which is obviously right-wing at the moment. We've got a Tory government here. We've got the Republicans in America. But then you've got the culture war, and you've got the cultural establishment, which is very much of the more social justice mindset. And that, by the way, has infected the Tory party as well. So, I mean, that's why it's so complicated. Because it's not as simple as right and left anymore. I mean, really what this is about liberty and authority, I think. But yeah, when it comes to comedy, it's now quite subversive to be a bit morally ambiguous in your comedy. It's quite subversive to be a Tory comic. You know, there aren't many. I can name...
It's almost unheard of.
There's about 3 or 4, you know, I think I could name. You know, they're just not there. The last survey, I think Artists for Brexit did a survey, and it was something like 97% of all people who identify as artists were pro-EU, right? So that's interesting. So within the artistic community, it just became the norm to say Brexit voters were stupid and racist, because that was, but that's punching down. That's what that is.
How is there this gap between the 52% of the country and then the 97% of those artists who believe differently? How can you have such an almost uniformity of anything?
Well, it's partly to do with privilege. I mean, in order to be a successful stand-up comic, it's much easier if you come from independent wealth. Much easier. That's why so many, disproportionately, comedians and artists are privately educated or from rich backgrounds, because they can afford to stay at home all day and get their parents to pay for everything and then go out and gig at night. You know, it's very hard if you're working a full-time job during the day and then going out. It's really, really difficult. So, and we have seen that there is a kind of class division. It becomes more complicated with Brexit because it almost felt like a kind of alliance of the working class and the aristocracy on the one side, and then the sort of upper middle class and the bourgeois on the other. And that's really interesting. But of course, the arts and comedy generally is so steeped in bourgeois politics, and of course, none of it's left wing. I mean, these people don't talk about redistribution of wealth or the welfare state. You know, they talk about microaggressions. You know, they talk about jokes about gay people being homophobic, even though they're not. They're just jokes about gay people, which is not the same thing as a joke that demonizes gay people. So this very weird, and above all, what I hear from a lot of self-identified left-wing comics is that certain jokes normalize hate. And what that means is, what the implication of that is basically working class people don't know the difference between a joke and real life. And so if they hear an off-colour joke, they'll all go out like these creatures, these gremlins, and they'll go out and they'll just sort of mindlessly enact violence on people. Utter nonsense. No one's ever been able to point at an act of violence that has been stimulated by a joke. You couldn't do it. It doesn't happen. Like Joe Brown. I mean, no one is waiting for Joe Brown's permission to go and throw battery acid at someone. That's just not a thing. So, you know, the idea that comedy is a literal representation of something, that it shouldn't be morally ambiguous, is just absurd.
Because just for those who don't know, Joe Brown made a joke about Nigel Farage being, I think, milkshaked with that battery acid or something, and then there was this huge uproar at the time saying she incited violence. Yeah.
You know, I'm unpersuaded of the whole incitement to violence thing anyway. I think that, you know, there needs to be a serious discussion about what qualifies as incitement to violence. A joke is not.
Yeah.
A joke is never inciting violence. She wasn't saying go out and throw battery acid at people. You may not like the joke, right? A lot of people I know found it really offensive, deeply offensive. But when Nigel Farage suggested that the police should get involved, that was a mistake. Because, you know, what he should have said is, I find that really offensive, I think it's really distasteful, and I don't think it's funny. He's totally entitled to say that, you know? But she was performing, you know, on a show called Heresy. The context is clear. It's about saying things that you're not meant to say. If you listen to the recording, there's a big laugh from the audience. The audience liked it. You know, it doesn't matter if you liked it or not.
Is there any joke that you wouldn't tell?
Yeah, loads. I mean, I think as a comedian, you should think about it. I can justify every joke I've told. I think you should be able to defend your jokes. And I think if I can't defend my jokes, people should say that to me, you know? I mean, if I saw someone in a comedy club stand up and make jokes, which I just thought were just literally expressing horrible racist views, I would say something. I'd be the first to say something. I'd never seen that, though. I've literally never seen that. But I would say something. I think you have to be able to defend your jokes.
So what kind of jokes wouldn't you tell?
Well, I wouldn't do the punching down thing. I guess that's why. But here's the thing.
That's where you draw the line.
Yeah, but here's the thing. That's my line.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to go out and tell jokes, even if they were genuinely horrible homophobic jokes, that's up to you. That's your line. I think the only line you can possibly draw is for each individual comic to have their own line. That's up to their conscience.
Let audiences decide.
Let audiences decide, right? Okay, the whole freedom of speech system is about you say what you want, and then other people can say what they think about that, right? And that's a good system. That works. I mean, there's this myth. I hear it all the time from Guardian columnists about how, oh, you're saying that the freedom of speech means freedom from consequences. I literally know nobody who thinks that. Like, consequences are great if it means more speech, if it means protest, if it means disagreement, dissent. I'm all for that, 100%. What we mean when we say that free speech shouldn't have consequences is no consequences of being arrested or beaten up, right? That's the distinction. You know, I think if you find something, if a joke, I mean, I've had it recently. I posted a joke a couple of weeks ago, and a number of people found it offensive, and they contacted me, and a lot of them were angry. Some were just rude, and I ignore them. But some asked me to talk through my thought process, and I did. The joke was an anti-racist joke, which was interpreted as a racist joke. Well, that's happening more and more, though, because I think because of the way the social justice activists talk about comedy as being damaging and hateful, is that people now are sort of having a more literal-minded interpretation of jokes and completely misconstruing it, getting it all backwards. So it's difficult now to joke about these issues without being misinterpreted.
Let's talk about 2020 comedy, the mainstream comedy, and then we'll get on to your kind of style of comedy, which is completely different, I think. I mean, I've been to your comedy shows, it is completely different. So if I go and switch on the TV on Friday night, I go and see Have I Got News For You or Mock the Week or one of these kind of BBC programmes, do you personally think they are funny? And do you think what I find really interesting is that someone made a point to me, the jokes that they make aren't necessarily funny, but the people in the audience clap because they agree with them politically.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Someone said that recently. I can't remember who it was. I wish I could. They said that if you know if it's a progressive comic because there's more applause than laughter. And I think that's hit it right on the nose. You know, I'm always really mistrustful. If I do a joke, I mean, when I toured with the Jonathan Pye show, and I did the opening slot, was the opening 25 minutes. And of course, and I was mocking the Tories, mocking Theresa May, and the audience was predominantly left-wing. And I'd get rounds of applause for the jokes about Theresa May, and then afterwards I'd have to reflect and think, is the joke good enough? Are they applauding just because they hate Theresa May? But the good thing about that tour is the audiences were also predominantly pro-EU, and I was doing a pro-Brexit set to that audience. And so I had to make sure that the material was good, because you should be able to do jokes to anyone about anything, and it should work. That's how you know whether a joke works or not. But yeah, when I watch those sorts of shows, I mean, the thing is, comedians are terrible audience members, by the way. Like, we don't laugh very much at comedy. We sort of look at it and think, would I have done that? Or, I could see how that joke works. We're terrible. That's why if you get too many comedians in an audience, you tend to not do well. So I'm not the best person to judge on that, but I find it a bit obvious if it is just...
is it quite lazy, though,
comedy? I wouldn't like to say it's lazy. I think we're all working pretty hard. I have a kind of inherent sympathy for all comedians.
I mean, it's pretty easy to make jokes about the Tories, isn't it? Every day, every week. Is
it easy though to write a good joke about the Tories? I don't think so. I think you can write lazy jokes about anything, but there are some vehemently anti-Tory comics who are hilarious and clever and sharp about it and can make Tory supporters laugh. Right? That's the dream. I agree with you. Like, sometimes, if your punchline is Brexit voters are racist, well, I'm not going to laugh at that because it's not true, for one thing. And also, it's not funny or insightful or a good quality, a good standard of comedy.
Is there a backlash against the kind of mainstream comedy? Now, obviously, you run your own comedy show, Comedy Unleashed, and you're doing your tour with Douglas Murray, and you're going to be talking to people all across the country in May about this, which is going to be, I'm sure, very interesting for young people.
I hope so.
So is there a backlash? Do you see sort of huge numbers coming in and being interested in this comedy?
Well, yeah. I mean, so Douglas and I are doing this tour called Resisting Wokeness, which does sound quite provocative. But actually, in truth, we do want to get anyone who agrees or disagrees with us. I mean, Douglas and I disagree on all sorts of things anyway. I mean, he comes very much from the conservative tradition, and I very much come from the left-wing tradition. So we have that. But we do share this concern about woke culture and about social justice and about the way it divides society. But more than anything, it's this general feeling that so many people have that they have to be very careful about what they say, right? Now, we're not talking about censorship here. We're not saying that there's some sort of there's people saying, no, you mustn't say this, you know. I'm often accused of saying, oh, you can't say anything anymore, which is a statement I've never said because I don't believe, and I don't know anyone who says that, actually. What we're saying is that people are nervous about what they say, about speaking truth or what they perceive to be truth, about joking at work, all this kind of thing. They get very nervous because they get misinterpreted, get reported to HR, they lose jobs, they lose livelihoods. You've got social justice mobs on Twitter who will smear and attack and demonize and destroy your life. I mean, they're not good people. So I want to talk about that. And we want to go around the country and we'll have a big Q&A with people. I mean, above all, most of the things that drive me are a real hatred of bullying, right? And I can see that the social justice movement legitimizes bullying. It makes it okay. It makes it okay for Antifa to beat up a gay Vietnamese journalist and call it opposing white supremacy. I mean, just think about that for a moment. It doesn't make any sense. But it makes it okay to go after people's employers, to target them and say, this person had this opinion, so you should fire them. It makes it okay to trawl through everything anyone has ever said, try and find something remotely objectionable and make an issue of it and try and ruin their lives, right? This is bad behavior. This is bullying. And so I want to mock it because I want to stand up against that. The problem is when you do that, they go after you. I mean, that's fine. That's part of it. You know, I'm in a really privileged position because I work in comedy and the media, so I can say whatever I want, and I don't have a boss. And Douglas has said this before. He doesn't have someone in charge of him. We can't get fired for what we say. It's why Ricky Gervais says whatever he wants. No one can fire him. You know. So there's a freedom to that, and we have this incredible privilege. And what I want to do with the tour is get people along who don't have that freedom, don't have that privilege. You know, when I was working as a teacher, I would have to, if I was still a teacher, can you imagine I'd have to be very, very careful? Well, it wouldn't be possible, would it? I couldn't have my Titania McGrath character tweeting the way she does and then go into work. It was already bad enough when I was a teacher. I used to go in and the kids had printed out like quotes from my set and put it on the desk. Or I had someone complain to one of the head mistresses about, there was a parent complained, like, I've Googled this guy, this is the stuff did you know about this before you employed him? It started getting untenable, you know, in the end.
Wow.
And you can't, but even like people joking at work in the staff room, you know what people do now is they go on WhatsApp and they encrypt their jokes. Can you think about that for a second? They're actually having to encrypt it in case it's overheard and misinterpreted or misconstrued, you know?
What if you're on Sheffield University? I don't know if you've seen this recent story where
Nuts.
They're hiring, I think it's £9.34 an hour if anyone's watching. You can go to Sheffield University and be hired to prevent micro aggressions.
Sure. So this is the Stasi, right? So this is and it's so bad, right? When a university is paying its students to snitch on other students, to eavesdrop. And did you see some of the examples they gave, right? So the microaggression thing is like, if you say God bless you when someone sneezes, that's a microaggression against atheists, right? Or the examples they give, where are you really from, right? Which isn't something that I hear very often, but then I'm not a person of colour, I suppose. But then also the people I speak to who would fall into that category, they never hear it either. So it's an interesting one, that.
And the other one they gave on the BBC website, I think, was, why are you trying to find everything offensive?
Which is a good question. Particularly for them, you know. Yeah. One of the examples they gave is insane. It was stop telling me about your holiday to Africa. I've never been there, or something.
South Africa, yeah.
Literally, no one has ever said that. Literally, no one has ever said that, except for me just then because I was quoting it. But it's a fantasy. But also, it's just not good to foster that kind of mistrust and division, right? And to impose this idea that there is one way of seeing the world, and that must be monitored by the authorities, and we're going to pay kids to do it, you know? What else is a university for but to explore interesting, alternative, difficult ideas, to have those debates? I mean, what the hell? I mean, that one is a particularly egregious example, but there are lots of them. I mean, Oxford Union recently banned applause, clapping at events because they wanted jazz hands. Just doing that because it's less triggering. Less triggering. Although why that
people
isn't...
with all sort of sensory problems or something.
Exactly. So, but again, as some blind people point out, that's not good for them because they can't hear when things are going. That sort of stuff is, and again, right, it comes from a good place, right? So there are some people with sensory issues, right? But they make provisions in their own life to deal with that, right? What they don't do is try and make everyone else change, because that's like the essence of entitlement. You know, if I have an allergy to a certain food, I don't demand that no one else eat that food. We must remove this from the shelves because I might be offended, right? that's what a lot of this is tied into entitlement, right? And we do, like, we're a good nation of good people who make provisions for people. We make sensible provisions when it comes to disability access, when it comes to people's illnesses, when all that sort of thing. We do it to an extent. But what we don't do is completely ditch a tradition such as applause, which is frankly quite instinctive. You know, babies just do it naturally, you know, to register approval. And try and re-engineer society and not even to help those few people. Because actually, I bet you most of them don't give a damn. What it is they're saying, look how good we are, look how virtuous we are. And I know I'm doing that thing of intuiting their motive, but it's difficult to get around, isn't it? I mean, whenever I'm on Twitter and things like that, and you see either pronouns announced in the bio or a rainbow gay flag, right? I can guarantee they're going to be a pretty nasty piece of work. Like most of the nasty, horrible, vicious vitriol I've had, they've always got pronouns in the bio. And the thing about that is, it's meant to signify tolerance. It's meant to say, I'm a good person and I'm inclusive. But then it's like, it's the most angry, bullying, nasty, vicious behaviour that comes with it. Tends to. Not all. You know, sometimes people are just trying to be inclusive for trans people. But a lot of the time, it's just, it's basically saying, it's like a label saying, I'm compassionate. Now I hope you burn in hell. And I hope you die in pain. You know, it's that weird kind of cognitive dissonance that's going on there.
It's this kind of odd patronising to various groups, because let's take cultural appropriation, which is one of their big sort of things that they like to complain about. If you go and actually speak to people who are Mexicans who get offended at people wearing kind of sombreros at Halloween, or if you go and speak to Native Americans where people are wearing kind of Native American costumes, they don't care. None of them care.
Know. It's really interesting. It's a soft form of racism when someone says, I can speak on behalf of an entire people, right? And you get this quite a lot. You had this with Afua Hirsch writing in the New York Times, I think it was, about saying that all black Britons think that Meghan's been treated from a position of racism. All black, I mean, she's basically saying, arrogating to herself the role of speaking on behalf of all black. I mean, how patronising and arrogant, you know? And you get this all the time. You get this with, there was an example in the Atlantic did a study about political correctness, and they found that the vast majority of people who find that political correctness is a danger, is actually going too far and is a danger, tend to be the very people it's aimed at protecting, minority groups, people of colour. And the ones who support it tend to be posh white liberals. So you've got this. That's what Titania is all about. That's why Titania is a rich Kensington girl, right? Who's never had any issues in her life. Like, she's had everything on a plate. Because she patronises minority groups, she sees them as pets. You know, she's a kind of racist. She is, but she's masking it all in this glow of virtue, and that's the thing that I see an awful lot from anyone who speaks on behalf of anyone. I hate it if someone says like, gay people shouldn't have to listen to this joke. I think, why do you get to decide what gay people get to listen to? You know, why do you say that? It's not up to you. You know, it's up to the individual. I think that's where identity politics leads us. It leads us to this myth, this illusion that we are all homogenous, that all gay people are like this and all black people are like this. You know, so when Peter Thiel came out as a Republican supporter, and who was it? The Advocate, which is a gay magazine in America. The Advocate said he may sleep with men, but he's not gay because he supports the Republicans. Or Kanye West putting on a MAGA hat, and all of a sudden he's not black, really. You know, and you do get people say this stuff. I'm not making this stuff up. It's like, really, identity now is about politics, is about your political worldview. Well, there are gay Republicans, gay Democrats, gay people on the left, gay people on the right. We're individuals, and you have to see us as individuals. That's why it's so infuriating.
You touched on there where people's minds are at, and I know it's impossible to really know this, but I think it's an interesting idea of, are the woke people in the majority? Are they in the minority? Where do you think people are generally at in, let's say, Britain and America? Very
much in the minority, but like I say, they're disproportionately represented in the media. So therefore you think they're the majority, you think they're everywhere. And also because they are in the human resources departments, and because they are in management, and because there's not many of them, but they occupy the powerful positions, and that's why it's dangerous. So that's also why people get surprised with election results and referendum results all of a sudden, because you've got a silent majority. People know that if they speak out about this stuff, they'll have their lives ruined, and they're not in a privileged position like some of us, where it doesn't matter if you speak out. It does matter to most people. So what you get is you just get silent resentment that is brewing. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. So we need to. That's part of the point of the tour. We need to have the conversations so that people feel they are having the conversation. We had the same thing with immigration. The fact that we said for many decades, ever since Enoch Powell, really, in the Rivers of Blood speech. I mean, one of the worst things about that speech. There was lots of terrible things about that speech. The worst thing about it was that it completely made discussion about immigration impossible for a long, long time. You know, and as a result of that, you ended up with this kind of brewing, kind of harbouring resentment against immigrants. Right? I'm very pro-immigrant, and I think that pro-immigration, and I think you need to have a sensible discussion about immigration and not demonise people who are concerned about wage depression or various consequences of immigration and freedom of movement. That's a legitimate concern to have, and we have to be able to have that conversation without anyone throwing the word racist about. You know, so so it is that thing of, yes, it's a minority view, but it is escalating. And it is coming mostly from my generation, I have to be honest about it. I mean, I think I can't stand this sort of demonisation of Generation Z and the millennial generation of being snowflakes and saying that, you know, they're all... there is a problem with resilience amongst young people, I know, because I've taught young people. But that's our fault. That's our fault. That's our generation, the way that we cultivated and taught them.
And I think it's these things that don't help either.
Smartphones don't help either. But in truth be told, a lot of the resistance that I see and a lot of the really kind of extreme social justice stuff comes from people of my age. I mean, I did a talk at Aberystwyth University recently, and I was invited by the International Politics student group, right? And they were great, and they didn't agree with everything I said, and there was some did, some didn't, and there was real discussion, and people wanted to talk and they wanted to be challenged, right? The politics department, refused to publicise the event because they said, and they showed me the email, so I know what they said. They said something like, any talk that was opposed to woke culture is not in line with our diversity values. Right, that's what they said, right?
At a university.
At a university, and this is a politics department. So not only did none of the politics department even turn up to see it, and to be challenged and to talk, they actively didn't publicise it. They were actively opposed. The students were totally up for it, and they wanted the discussion. So I'd just say be very wary whenever you hear these stories about the extreme, like I mentioned with the student union at Oxford. That's a few student activists with way too much clout. That's what that is. Or the ones that no platform or protest or put pressure on. And then you end up with speakers being disinvited because of security issues, because it is too expensive to hold those talks. Those are not normal students. They are the minority who love, well, I presume really love the power. I mean, who gets into student politics, you know? But it's not fair to smear a whole generation on this basis. It just isn't. And the more I talk to young people, the more I realise how sick they are of this, particularly Generation Z. I mean, let's not forget the millennials are getting old now. And Generation Z are turning against that whole culture. And they're you know, so many of them that I talk to, so many of the very young sort of people in their late teens who come to the Comedy Unleashed night, and they just tell me how sick they are, because not only do they have to deal with all the nonsense, which has now been institutionalised, they've also got to deal with the perception that their entire generation are these weak, feeble creatures. So there's sort of a double whammy, you know? So, yeah.
Once you create that kind of mainstream woke establishment, then you're inevitably going to have the kind of rebellious young people who go against that, right?
Yeah, and they won't be able to cope, will they? Like the people who, because they've convinced themselves they're on the right side of history, and they've convinced themselves that they're rebelling against the establishment, and they don't see that they are the establishment, and they're the ones that people are going to rebel against. They're not going to cope. They're going to have a nightmare.
A great example of this kind of distance between let's say, the woke movement and young people is Ricky Gervais. Now, he made a fantastic monologue at the Golden Globes recently that went absolutely mega viral. I mean, huge amounts of people were watching this. And obviously, it hit a huge zeitgeist in, I think, many young people on Twitter, for example.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Because what he was doing was, he was basically standing there and saying what he wanted to say. And what was really great about that is he was punching up at powerful people, you know? He was attacking major multi-billion corporations. He was attacking the Hollywood elite. These are the most pampered, rich, privileged people in the whole world. They couldn't be...
Quite literally.
Yeah, literally the most privileged people who have ever existed, right? And yet after that, he was called a conservative. He was told he was right-wing. And all this sort of...
By the media.
And even from prominent left-wing comedians saying that he's right-wing. And it's like, these are the very same prominent left-wing comedians who once upon a time would have applauded someone railing against the hypocrisy of the ultra-rich. And now they're not. Maybe because they are that now. But it's incredible that what he was doing there, which is so clearly an attack on pomposity and hypocrisy, and really well done and really funny, because those gigs aren't easy, right? Like that audience, it's not a comedy night. It's not,
and he's still got laughs from some of them.
Like even when Michelle Wolf did her president, at the president's press dinner, right? And it's not really my cup of tea, and I didn't like it. But I had to admire her because they weren't enjoying it. They were there was a kind of discontent. But it's tough. It's tough to go there. And also, you're hired to do a roast. You're hired to. And that's why the thing is though, with Ricky Gervais's thing. I mean, he was doing the sort of jokes that he's done for many years. Like he's always pricked pomposity. He's done it at the Golden Globes before. I don't know why anyone was surprised that he did it again. But I think what is different is now the culture shifted so quickly. So I think whereas if he'd have said that on his first outing at the Golden Globes, they would have reacted in the way they react, and some people would have been offended and all the rest of it. But not to the extent. I mean, now people saying, he should never be allowed to again. The Independent, I think it was a hoax article again, it wasn't me, saying that he should, that hopefully this will be the end of Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes, all the rest of it. And these very prissy, puritanical Mary Whitehouses, I mean, they are Mary Whitehouse, basically, saying that this is disgusting, this is disgraceful, all the rest of it. And that just makes it funnier. This is the other thing. It makes it funnier, and he embraces that and plays on that. When people call him right-wing because he's mocked the posh, the rich, that's funny, right? It's the same reason why millionaire gardening columnists talking about how oppressed they are is inherently funny, right? Hypocrisy is funny.
Well, Ricky Gervais, I think he is one of, if not the most popular and rich comedians in the world.
Right,
I mean, his Netflix deal with his recent stand-up was, I think, the biggest in the world. So maybe he kind of represents that the majority of people are with you and are with his kind of side of the argument, rather than with these kind of woke comedians.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's never denied that he's in a really privileged position. I don't think he would.
But he came from this working class background, and I think that's why he's like he is, because he's lived both the kind of life of most people watching and the life of these rich celebrities. So he feels that he's able to kind of criticise them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's tricky because he has to entertain the people in the room, but he also has to entertain the people at home. So you end up with that kind of. It's difficult to judge, but I think the solution is just to go all out and don't self-censor. That's the thing. I mean, what I find generally in comedy is the biggest threat is self-censorship. It isn't censorship, right? It isn't. It isn't these sort of weird little comedy nights that have the rules that you can and can't say certain things. There's not many of them, by the way. There are some, and they're entitled to have those rules. It's fine. It's your club. You do whatever you want. That's not a problem with me. But I think it's really bad for the art form. It's really bad when you say to a comic, you better curtail yourself, you better constrain what you're going to say, which is why at our club we say just do whatever you want. Don't worry, because if you offend people, then that's fine. That's part of it. There should always be the potential for offence in a comedy night. If you're just gratuitously offensive and unfunny, no one's going to laugh at you, and people might say to you, that's just that's not good, and that should happen.
So finally, let's talk about the solutions. Let's talk about the optimism, because I've asked all my guests, why are you optimistic this year? What brings you optimism? And I want to ask you that into relation to comedy. What are the solutions? How can we move forward? How can we move away from this kind of polarisation of people, the disgusting abuse people get online? Because someone comes up to me and calls me a racist. How am I meant to deal with that?
Right. You're assuming I'm optimistic. You're actually right. I'm very optimistic. I think it's about, we've got to get critical thinking back in schools, actually. People need to learn that if they throw an insult, what we used to call an ad hominem attack, if they buy into this guilt by association thing, so you spoke to that person, therefore you're evil. The left has always had this problem, actually. It's typically right-wingers have always thought that left-wingers are a bit stupid and a bit misguided. But left-wingers have typically said that right-wingers are evil and diabolical and should go to hell. That's the distinction, right? So I think the first thing is always assume that the intentions of the person you're talking to are better than you think. The instinct on the part of certain left-wing activists to say Tory voters, they want poor people to die, they want all of that sort of stuff. It's obviously not true. What it is it's a different economic worldview. They believe that if we attract more rich people to the country, we accrue more tax. There's a trickle-down effect, and actually it benefits the poor, right? But that's the generous interpretation. That's a good faith interpretation. And then it comes about, well, which solution is better? Is it wealth redistribution or is it trickle-down economics, right? So then that's a discussion. That's a good faith discussion. So the best way to deal with it is to try and cultivate those kind of good faith discussions. Don't entertain people who come up and call you a racist, right? So you're not obliged to have a conversation or a discussion with anyone who insults you. Just ignore and block anyone who is abusive, right? There's absolutely no point. Because they've already announced that they are not in a position to be persuaded. They've already announced that they're not good people and that they're not open-minded. I mean, some people I've seen Peter Hitchens engage with people on Twitter who have just insulted him. And, his view is that you should always try. And that's great for him, but I think most people should, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of skill, So I'd say, no, but talk to those who are willing to be spoken to. Talk to those who are willing to politely disagree. And set that example for yourself. I think, look, it's not like right-wing people don't get aggressive and don't throw insults. And I think anyone individually should be able to politely disagree without resorting to mudslinging. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is not to assume bad faith on the other person. And if people just agreed on that, I mean, I think 99% of Twitter arguments would disappear if people stopped mischaracterizing what the other person says. All of my Twitter arguments seem to be people saying, you secretly think this. And I say, no, I don't. And where do you go from there? Then it's just a matter of faith. And that gets us absolutely nowhere. The other thing is don't debate on Twitter, probably. I think get to forums where you're actually face-to-face. That's another reason we wanted to do the tour. So I'm hoping that people will come along and challenge us and we can have the discussion like adults, basically. But I do think instilling this in schools is important. Now, I mean, because I come from that background, I used to teach critical thinking. I used to be a teacher. I don't know whether having critical thinking lessons is the way. I mean, that's what I did. I'm not sure. It was seen as a kind of DOS subject. I think it's instilling it into every aspect of every curriculum. Just the idea of being open-minded and listening to what people are actually saying, not what you imagine they say. All of those very basic skills that I think
exposing
we've lost.
people to different views as well.
Exactly. So yeah, that's exactly right. So in making sure that people aren't stuck in their echo chambers. But the effort sort of has to, I mean, yes, sort of educationally you can socialise people into doing that. But I think as adults we have to take a responsibility ourselves to open ourselves up to different viewpoints, to read different ideas. I know why we don't. There's a comfort in just having our existing prejudices reinforced. It's more fun for me to read an article by someone who just agrees with me and puts my ideas in a better way than I could. And there's a kind of excitement to that. It's better for me to read someone who doesn't agree and for me to work out why, for me to refine my own views and maybe to acknowledge that I'm wrong. I mean, that's the main reason for talking to someone who disagrees with you, is you might be wrong. And I'm still changing my mind about all sorts of things, and that's what I want, what I really guard, and I fail on this an awful lot, but what I am trying my best to do is to allow myself to be persuaded when I might be wrong, to not hold on to things when they've been disproved, taking the more sort of scientific approach, and to actually welcome, if someone proves that one of my points is wrong, in my mind, if they prove it, that should be something I celebrate, because that's bringing me closer to the truth, not something I resent. There's a thing called identity quakes. This is how it's called identity quakes, where if your whole identity is wrapped up in a politicized worldview, and suddenly you realize part of it isn't correct, you feel like part of you dies. It's actually quite traumatic. But we have to embrace that possibility. That when we're wrong, we should be proven wrong, and that's a good thing for us to do. There's a really good book by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay called How to Have Impossible Conversations. I really would recommend it because they talk about how you do this and how you have these difficult conversations, and it's so important at the moment. But unfortunately, because of social media, it's not just confined to social media, it's infected our politics. And that's why you get major politicians, just doing the same thing, throwing insults, saying that the other side are evil, saying that the other side want to do all these horrible things, throwing about words like fascism and all of that sort of stuff. We need the adults back in the room, basically. We need to not dignify that stuff. That's what I'd say.
And on that, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks a lot.